Hello everyone and welcome to the Backroom Dungeon. Now, I'm sort of been inspired here by those small buildings or whatever you'd find in something like the Elder Scrolls Skyrim. You find that small building and it just sort of keeps going. You think you found something small and then all of a sudden you realise actually there's a bigger dungeon there than you thought. Before we jump into sort of the story and the idea of the sets, what's actually here? Well, I've used WizKids WarLock tiles. I've used 2 of the angled sets, 1 town and village, 1 dungeon tiles, and then 1 of each of the base sets of those as well. So this is 4 sets, pretty much the majority of the tiles, pretty much all of the wall pieces. There are a number of like these the window pieces left and doors and stuff still in the box. But you're not going to get too much more out of the 4 sets. So that's like the 2 base sets and the 2 angles expansions. And I really try to play with angles in this build. Now let's jump in and see where players enter. Players are going to enter in the top of the shack. Now the idea is that it's a small shack that then sort of unravels as they go. Now you're going to come in. It looks kind of a normal sort of area. It's got, a bed, some barrels, shiny dice. It's got, the table, and then there is a giant frog. Now, you can you can choose whether that frog is going to attack, or maybe that's just the person who owns the shack that's maybe been hexed or whatever, turned into that giant frog. Anyway, the idea of this room is just for them to progress and move downstairs. As they go down the stairs, they come into and fight this, well, not small, this giant spider that's sort of lurking round the corner, slightly in the shadows. And that is when they realise the door to the rest of the dungeon. And you could easily have just this section of the build off on its own. You didn't have to have this part all out on the table, and most of this is built with sections in mind. You could easily sort of just have this bit so the players don't really know that this is going to be a much bigger shack than they originally thought. So when they go through and open this door up, they're just sort of confronted by a bit of a choice. A left door, a right door, and there's a very exquisite looking chair in front of them. There's an animated armor figure in the corner that's just stood there. It doesn't do anything. Perhaps there's a trap though. If they sit on the chair, perhaps that animated armor comes to life. Maybe if they sit on the chair, the animated armor comes to life for them as an ally. You can decide maybe the party needs the help. Maybe the party needs the hindrance of that animated armor. You can decide. Well, the party then decide whether they want to go left or right. Now, regardless of which way they go, they're probably going to come up against all the enemies in this dungeon. But let's say they go left for now. Bringing the wizards through the doorway, they instantly will encounter some goblins. You've got a goblin ready to jump and pounce off the table, as well as a few others guarding a nice little loot chest behind here. But what they don't know, or maybe don't initially see, especially when the combat begins, is hidden behind the boulder, a little bit further in, there's an orc and a couple more goblins. Another chest, but a few more enemies that will be slowly working their way down. So if the party isn't quick enough, or maybe just has a really low perception, these guys are going to sneak up and join the fight. Maybe interrupting the fight, getting high up in the initiative order of a round, or maybe they just pop round the corner and then the players know, well, it's not just 4 goblins they're up against, it's 6 and an orc. If you manage to get past here, well, as you're going along this thin corridor, you're going to start to see a rather warm foe. Now, you could have come across this from a different way and taken that fire elemental out first if you'd have gone on the right door. You'd have worked your way down and potentially have come into the area with a little bit more room to maneuver around this guy. Now, I just wanted to use him. You could use a non-fire elemental, considering there's lots of areas of wood around, but you know, that could be a little bit of extra fun. Maybe you could some areas could start catching fire, so the players can't go into there as a sort of an area of effect. But otherwise, it's just a fun baddie to take down for the right sort of party. That area is just kind of really just to throw a few more angles in, and I kind of like having in the middle of this dungeon this sort of negative space, this area that you never go to, and it's kind of, it just makes it feel maybe a bit more like a cavernous dungeon. It's not one that's been built, it's one that's been chiseled in, and they've sort of chiseled walkways, and that's why some of the walkways, certainly like on this one on the right, I've tried to not just have a straight walkway. Yeah, I've got a straight wall here, but I've also then got sort of one that's got a bit more of a wiggle in. It kind of looks a little less, not necessarily man-made, but just looks maybe like it could be sort of more of a natural flowing dungeon rather than one that's sort of, you know, you'd find in the sort of a dungeon underneath a castle or a keep or something like that. Moving out of this area where the negative space is, well, this is part of one of my favourite parts of this build. I really like the fact this part is sort of the extra height up. Having height in a WarLock tiles build is, I think, really cool, but this is something completely different. Now, with the angles, this is just about possible, and a few of this areas of this build certainly would have been much easier with 1-inch tiles. I don't have them yet, they're not available in the UK. So you could do a much better job of this if you're in the US or Canada or something where they've got them already. But I really like this feature. I have managed to, by clipping a normal tile into the sort of diagonal side of an angled tile, I've managed to offshoot a chunk of the dungeon at a 45-degree angle. Yes, maybe because of the rest of the dungeon design, you don't maybe notice it as much as you could, but I really like the fact that the grid is in this, all of this part, all of this, it's in this direction. And then as soon as you get to this section, the grid is 45 degrees twisted, and that's ready for the last fight. Now, when you get in here, you've got sort of a table that's been flipped over, a barrel, so maybe full of some mead. Maybe you could fill your mead back up. But can you hear that noise? All of a sudden, there's a banging on the door that you can see, and it's destroyed. The door comes off its hinges, and you are faced by an ogre staring down at you. And he's not very happy. He's been sort of trapped in there for a while, banging down on that door. Well, coming through here, the angles here, I think, really make it sort of that there's a bottleneck. Do you wait for the ogre to come to you a little bit more and have sort of the area at the back of this room, or do you advance into sort of that bottleneck and really try and hold him there and defeat him? Well, that's obviously an option for your players in the encounter, and I just like the way that the angles of the build really allow it to feel constricted as well, and I think that works quite nicely here. Now, once you've managed to off the ogre, you have completed the dungeon. But have you? Well, there's a door at the end here, mostly because I didn't have a spare flat wall piece, but perhaps we'll pick up here next time for another dungeon tiles build using WarLock tiles. That was the Backroom Dungeon. You started in this small shack that's kind of not that even that run down. You found goblins and orcs and spiders and stuff like that on your way. Even a fire elemental, though, you know, I just wanted to use a cool mini. I think the angles have worked really well at making the set this build feel like it just sort of flows off in loads of directions. It gives players a choice. Do they want to go left, want to go right, and follow the sort of the routes in different directions? It's got a few little sort of diagonal bits jutting off, giving sort of areas. And then my favorite piece, like I said, I really like the way using one of those angled tiles and like end caps and bits like that, just to plug the gaps of the walls, this sort of 45-degree offshoot. You cannot do that without the angled tiles, and that's why I think it's a great feature to sort of have put into this build. Just before we go, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this piece over so we can have a look. If I just remove all of these bits, we can show the underside, and I think that's the important bit here. This is how I've managed to get that to be that 1/2 inch tall, to be sitting alongside the wall height. By having that, you really do, using these inside walls, it does mean you can't use the inside walls on the other side, but it really does sit, and it actually sits quite strong as well. You really do sort of get some strength in that, and as you can see, it just sort of sits height-wise at the same height as the normal walls. Check out the other builds of the month. Each one has sort of different ideas and such, from just a large expansive ones like this to just using one single dungeon tiles set. Next time we'll pick up from this door and we'll see what happens next. But thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I'm Oliver East, signing out.